Welcome to the show today. My name is Douglas Gabriel from the American Intelligence Media, and today I'm interviewing a very famous person, the inventor of social media, a renowned author who has written an 800 gigabyte book that is offered for free on his amazing site, actually one of the most amazing sites on the internet, Americans for Innovation. And today we're going to interview him about a new book he's putting out, which I am absolutely thrilled to talk with you about, Michael.
Thanks, Douglas. Thanks for inviting me.
Your work has pointed out the Rothschilds, the true sources of Israel, why we're in the situation we're in with Israel, who are the Palestinians, their relationship to it, the whole lineage from Abraham and the Solomon gold, and all the questions that I couldn't get answers to in my research on the same exact topic. When you came along and we put our arrows together and we started working on this issue of really who is the hidden hand that is the ultimate puppeteer of the globalists. And eventually we came to the fact that it's the Pilgrim Society. But when you say that, people don't even know what that is. But now when you say Rothschild, what do they think? Oh, Illuminati. Well,
they all think that's the source.
In your book, you go into not only who the Illuminati are, why they were funded by the Rothschilds, what was going on, how that related to Sabbaty Zevi and Frankism and Sabbateanism, and all the funding of both of every war in America was funded from the Rothschild family. And I like to call them their bankster cronies because they all intermarried with each other. And until you know that the British were sending the Jews they didn't want, the Jews, and today I may have to do air quotes every time I say Jew.
I have never seen you do that.
Because there's no such thing. When I first met Michael, I'd say, Michael, there's no Jews. And the word Hebrew is made up. It has to do with a language, not a people. And by the way, if you look at DNA, there are no 100% Hebrews, Jews, Levantians, call them what you want. You can use whatever source you want. Michael has gone through that with Mike and the Miners, the best researchers, the best think tank that Tyler and I have worked with anywhere on the internet or in all the work that we've done together. And so now what you've done is, I wasn't kidding when I said 800 gigabytes of truth history book called The Truth Will Set You Free. They can go to your site. They can get that. They can then now see the beginning of a set of books you're going to do, which basically are like turnkeys for individual topics. And then if you wish to have the thousands and thousands of pages of documentation, which, let's see, you keep changing the name. I think you called it prime evidence or judicially acceptable evidence, judicially recognizable evidence.
That's it.
You don't play games. When we met, you were going through every single conspiracy theory to find out if it was true, if any part of it was true. And what you found out in most cases, and us along with you, is that we went through to the other side and found out it was much, much worse than we thought in most cases. And in other cases, it's just a poof. For instance, calling the Rothschilds the Illuminati and blaming everything in the modern world on the Illuminati is absolutely silly. When they go to truth history, they can find out about Weishaupt and the fact that the Rothschilds paid him to write them the Brothers of Light ritual, which was never used. And it was to get them British aristocracy status as a Mason. And then I had never realized until I started studying with you that the British had their own Knights of Malta. Well, of course, they got their own Pope, their own church, they got their own bank, they got the City of London. They got it all. But I also didn't realize, though I was preaching from even when you met me, that the Pilgrim Society really was the major factor. But I would follow that through and jumped right over something that's in your new book called The Hidden Hand. Great title. Unraveling the Rothschilds in Israel. Two of the most important things going on in our modern world. The banksters' control of economic slavery, still going on since Babylonian times. They'll read about this in your book. And on the other hand, you have the world plan, the 24-point plan of the Pilgrim Society for World Hegemony, which basically they've done a really good job on. You won't find the Pilgrim Society mentioned, except in your work and our work, practically anywhere on the internet, though they're supposed to be free information. And you won't find anybody nailing who these people are, what their plan is, what they're doing today, how it goes back in history, how it's related to these Babylonian banksters who were really demon worshippers. So every time someone says Rothschild, they say they're pedophilias, they're demon worshippers, and they sacrifice children. Wait, you mean they worship Moloch? Yes, because they create wars and they kill people. They worship Mammon, which is money, which is the economic slavery of the whole world, or every part that they see there's a lot of money flowing. Rothschild families go there and they get a piece of it. And basically then the genius that you and your miners have discovered is the Empire Press Union or conference, and the way that turned into the most efficient propaganda machine ever created in human history to cover the trails of the Rothschilds and their bankster cronies. So I want to thank you, and I want to congratulate you on this new book, because I just read it, and I was honored to work with Tyler to write the preface for it. And I just think that it's the beginning of helping people who can't understand the mammoth treasury of evidence to convict the criminals of our age that can be found on your site, and particularly through Truth History and through the book, which is a digital book called The Truth Will Set You Free. Congratulations, Michael. It's about time that some of these people got brought to the light and see justice.
I think you're right. I think that it is the time. And as you recall, when I started this journey as a civil engineer, my approach perhaps was different than if I was a scholar or a historian or an investigative journalist, because my interest as an engineer is problem solving. And one of the things any civil engineer knows, you can't fix a problem until you know what it is. You have to define the problem first. That's your first shot. Now, what I've noticed all these years is that when these various perspectives come out, which are often labeled conspiracy theory, generally they're not all theory, that there is some evidence to support what a person is saying. But what I've noticed over the more than 12 years of focusing on this is that what most people do when they're investigating, they will go back to a period of time and then find some nuggets of truth in that period of time, and then they extrapolate their story well beyond its boundaries. And so the key there is to find the context for that, and that's what I think most people don't have the patience for. And so they don't do it. And so consequently, they talk about it and they beat it to death until it reaches its ragged edges and then can't support the next round of hypotheses that come out of that. And then it goes off on the wrong trail. And then it's easily labeled as conspiracy theory. Well, I found that most of these have grains or prominent truth in them, but they're not in context. And so I, as a civil engineer, started working on this after the Supreme Court would not protect us in the theft of social networking by Facebook and others. And so we began to look at, okay, why didn't the court protect us? Because it's protection of patents is written into the Constitution. It's the only property right written into the Constitution. And yet our Supreme Court denied us that justice and that reward, and still have. But I'm off topic. So with this issue of the Rothschilds and the British Pilgrim Society, those weren't even in my wheelhouse. Now, I had heard all the theories all the years about the Rothschilds and that they were somehow central to it. And what I can see looking back is that there was a lot of truth in what people were saying. But again, it looks like everybody gets a specialty in their research of history, and then everything else gets left off to the side, or the person gets distracted. And so they never carry it forward. Well, that's what we spent the last 12 years doing, is carrying it forward until we found proof that would satisfy the civil engineer. And what I found is that has been a very attractive way of doing it. And when I met you and Tyler and the conclave, I found that you had done the same thing and had gone farther than anybody else I had seen. Now we have some other people in recent history that people will identify with, like Eustace Mullins, even some aspects of the
Lyndon LaRouche and his folks, very brilliant people.
Yes. And so there was a lot of useful research in what they provided. But at some point in each case, we found they fell short. With Houston, we now conclude that the Pilgrims had forced him not to talk about them, for example. And with the early exposure of the Pilgrim Society to the press in 1902, there were broadsheet double pages coverage of the first Imperial Press Conference in 1909. And yet, by the time we started looking for evidence related to that event, it was all gone. It disappeared. All the records were missing. And the documentation of that event were missing, not available. I had many librarians looking for it for me. And then we stumbled on it. And here I think God was directing us. We stumbled on it contained in a box in a offsite library of a small university in Ohio. And it took us two months to get them to go out and get it for us. We get it. We had it delivered to us in Columbus. And I remember telling you that delivery was delayed because the librarian, as she was documenting the book, ready to provide it to us, she got an announcement from the fire department that her house was on fire. Her kitchen had caught on fire. So we thought, wow, this must be some book if it's causing librarians' kitchens to go into flames. So anyway, it has been quite a trek. And we didn't know whether this approach we had would go anywhere. But we just kept faithfully going at it. And like you say, it's about 800 gigabytes now of files and proof. And then the other key element of our research in getting to this point for this book is that we're talking about, as it's turning out, I thought we were talking about maybe 50 years of history, maybe 100 years of history. But as we kept peeling back the onion, we kept marching back in history. And pretty soon we started asking ourselves, and this is something engineers are good at, is what's the problem here? What's the core problem here? Why is humanity so confused about these issues? And we discovered that there was a particular law written in Babylon called the Hammurabi Code. And Code 100 was the first time in modern human history where the practice of usury, charging interest on money loaned, was codified into a nation's law. And then what we saw from marching forward from that point on is that Babylon got very good with their attorneys and with their bankers and with their accountants in making sure that the king always got his piece of the action. And by inference, also the bankers and the lawyers also got their action. And they started creating more laws. These bankers started collecting the taxes for Babylon. And they, at some point along the way, back about 600 or 800 AD or BC, they started calling themselves Jews. And we thought, well, what are we seeing here? Because we saw all these thousands of cuneiform banking tablets with meticulously written out and documented contracts for human slavery, for goods and services also, for grain, for cattle, things like this, property, but also for payment of debts. And we saw how this payment of debts, when it went unpaid, would then enslave the spouse, would enslave the children. And then we knew from history that these people also practice human sacrifice. And then we started, well, who are these gods that these people are following? And then we see the names Moloch, Baal, Mammon. And we thought, wow, this is interesting, because we know some of those things from the Bible. And so we started connecting these dots. And then we said, well, let's see where usury marches in history. And that's what really opened up the historical vaults. And then we started noticing that historians and historical publishers either did not talk about what we discovered at all, or they talked about it very little and didn't carry it forward, and didn't make it a perspective that historians are supposed to give us. They're supposed to give us the long view. We weren't getting the long view with any of these details relative to usury and banking. And so I won't go into the whole sequence of events, but in one of the interesting pieces of history relative to about 600 BC, this was the exact time when the prophet Ezekiel and many other of the Hebrew prophets were railing against the practice of usury, charging of interest. Today, I think people are thinking, what? I borrowed money to buy my car or buy my house or buy luxury goods, whatever. How's that bad? Well, we need to reprogram ourselves, because what we're seeing is that the history of usury is the history of the demonic world marching through history. And right now it's got its claws in our culture to a great degree. And so if I were to bottom line, what we've discovered is that usury has been the downfall and the shortcoming of humanity ever since about 2000 BC. So in the description of these contracts from 600 BC that are supposedly Jewish bankers, that's at the same time as Ezekiel is saying, your practice of usury is an abomination. He actually used abomination in the English translation. But anyway, they describe these banks, and what we see is that historians actually describe these people as the Rothschilds of Babylon. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting perspective. The Rothschilds. So who are the Rothschilds? And so that led us to looking at the Rothschilds, for whom I had never gone before. I never looked at their history prior to mid 1700s, early 1700s, as most people have not. And so what we did is we specifically asked what was happening before that, because the Rothschilds just popped up in history, and they actually named their name Rothschild after a street in Frankfurt. So we said, what was going on that would be such a deep trend in humanity that the Rothschilds would emerge as a major banker? And then we went back in time and began looking at these Jews. I'm going to have to use your term. Jews popped up in about 800 AD, about 200 years before the First Crusade. And an Arab historian, not a Jew, not a Christian, it was an Arab, actually very clearly described a group of Jewish bankers in what it was then Baghdad as the Radanites. And that was named after a suburb of Babylon, a wealthy suburb of Babylon, where the Silk Road settlement banks existed. So the end of the Silk Road, all the way from China, would settle up in this area called Radan. And these people he named Radanites. He was the chief spy, the chief manager of the post office, and the chief historian and geographer for the Abbasid kingdom, the Caliphate. And so we see this tantalizing reference to another group of Jews about 1.5 millennia later that are a single, simple description of a people who claimed to be Jews and were bankers. And that pattern started becoming a theme. So we marched them forward, and we discovered that the Radanites were a part of William the Conqueror's conquest of England in 1066. and that he then ordered, he was a Frenchman, he then ordered an inventory of all property in England. And in that property document, which is called the Domesday Book, they actually describe Radanites as people who were the people who managed the books and the banking and the tax collection for England at the time. So we actually had historical records confirming that these Radanites had moved into England. And then in 1067, these guys were given a charter for what is called the City of London, in the center of London, where the shipping of the Silk Road Empire terminated in England. And that city, called the City of London, is still with us today. It's in its about 645th mayor. Its documents are well archived, and that is the government of the United Kingdom that is running not only the United Kingdom, but the entire British Commonwealth worldwide. And as we have discovered in their formation of the Pilgrim Society, is also heavily influencing American politics and American government and our military and our propaganda, and you name it, biowarfare. They are driving the bus as far as we can tell.
It's a complete system.
Yes.
And the City of London is New Babylon. And things haven't changed, and they worship the same beings, but they may not even call it that, but it doesn't matter. What you do every day is what you worship, and they worship money, and they worship control. And these are dynasties of banking families that
Yes.
interbreed to the point that the image that comes to mind with your book is when Evelyn de Rothschild is looming and hovering over Prince Charles and pointing his finger at him and saying, "You will do what I say." I mean, everyone wants to wonder what the Rothschild is telling the monarchy.
Right.
But let's remember that in those days, there was a thing called the court Jew, the most important person in the court, and the only person who could say there could be war because the money came from them. And then the court Jew went over to the king on the other side and gave them money to fight the other king. So they paid, but this has been going on since the Babylonian banking.
I think we need to keep saying that these are not Jews that
Correct.
we're talking about. They called themselves Jews because it was useful for business. But in fact, they're Babylonian Radanites, and they're pagans and have been pagans. And they're the ones that married into the monarchies of Europe.
That was the trick. That's why Esther married the king of Persia. That's why they'd always take their daughters and give it to the king of Egypt. I mean, this is the history of the Old Testament, is using their women to basically supplant the powers that be. Now, they learned that from the Assyrians. And so when we talk about the supposed Jews, I used to say, no, can we at least talk about the Hebrews? Because when you say Jews, there's at least two dozen different types of supposed Jews, none of which have a haplogroup identification even as a Levantian, let alone there is no such thing as a haplogroup identification of Hebrews or Jews or anything like that. There's no such thing. So if someone says they're an Ashkenazi Jew, your research has literally went backwards in time. That's where I'm at. I'm back there where the Sumeria affected the Chaldeans, and then the Chaldeans created Abraham, and the Abraham created not only the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews, but all of the Semitic tribes throughout all of Mesopotamia, all the way in the Near East. So when you go, but then you get three different versions of who Abraham is and what language he speaks and so on and so forth. But what I have found out is that's where the demon worship came from. The true Chaldeans followed Sumeria, and they were Turanians, and they believed in demons, not gods. And that's why you get all this mixture between gods and demons going on there. And that's when the confusion started, exactly as you said, when Hammurabi encoded the fact that money was more important than humans. Usury, and that's where we stand today.
Hammurabi Code number 100. He codified usury. And that, if you think today, what do we call that? We call that debt slavery. Because by doing compounded interest, if a person can't pay back the note, they're basically enslaved like an indentured servant to the bank who loaned them the money. And
And
that
our Rothschild central bank is a debt slavery, onus, debt created system, Ponzi scheme. Once they loan you the money and you can't pay it back, then you will never be able to pay it back. So, hello, this is a circular system. It's
yes.
a dog chasing its tail. And what we see here is like Carol Quigley was paid to go into the archives of the Pilgrim Society and to never mention the Pilgrim Society in his #1 book that is quoted for all these conspiracies. And so when you look closely, you will find the signature of the Rothschild family and their banker crony family dynasties, and it is
Well,
absolutely shocking.
let me make a comment about Quigley, because when we discovered this, all of Quigley's works, and started looking through them, we saw him talking about the Anglo-American alliance. And so we thought, well, he's going to mention the Pilgrims at some point, the First Imperial Press Conference, or the foundation of the Pilgrims in 1902, or their carrying forward and starting World War I and World War II. And we pulled his books, we got them digitized, and did global searches on each of his books, and he does not mention the Pilgrims once. So obviously he was paid to be silent about them. And why? Because they're a secret society. They are committed to being a secret society that practices Jesuit techniques, Masonic techniques in the way they carry out their business. And they've learned this from centuries of spying through the British East India Company, and then prior to that, in various maritime. East India Company was formed in 1600. So between 1067, when the city of London was formed, and 1600, there were 400 years there where the Radanites were using Britain. And that was actually, curiously enough, when all the Crusades were funded. Well, you got to ask yourself, who was funding all of those 8 or 10 or 12, depending on how you count it, Crusades? These were the banks. These were the Radanites. Were continuously creating war and conflict, and they did it in the name of Christianity. But I think we don't know the real history of the Crusades because of that. There was so much obscurity.
Now, you also point out that the Schofield Bible kind of pulled into, I don't want to use derogatory terms, but extraordinary respect for the Old Testament, let's call it that, and connected that to the Christian mission as if the Christian mission is to protect Israel. So in this very day, we have people who are fighting for the terrorists, the Hamas group, which is actually paid by Israel, so it's really confusing. But in Palestine, there are people who are fighting in America and killing for Palestine to be a second state. And now we have Bibi Netanyahu basically saying, no, there's not going to be a two-state solution. There's going to be no Gaza. I'm going to kill them all. And you say, but that's so shocking. No, go back in the Old Testament. It said that when the Hebrew faith conquered a village, many times they were ordered by God to knock down every stone in the village, every building, kill every man, woman, child, and animal. So this is nothing new. So this is an old fight that goes back to Cain and Abel. And the question would then be, and I'd love to tell the true history of the Israelites, we'll call them, because when you hear this history, you're not going to believe it because it's not what you've been taught in your church. And it certainly is not what you're taught in the history books. And when the truth, you have to face the truth, or at least the evidence, and then you can decide what the truth is, but you have to face the evidence. You're going to be shocked. And then the question will arise, why would people want to culturally appropriate being an Ashkenazi Jew? Why would they? Because basically you're saying, I am a Sogdian Silk Road secret language speaker who controls all the currencies and currency exchanges, and I control the forts and I control the military all the way here to China, and nobody has a war without our money. And so it's actually something that's very desirous. Why wouldn't the king of Khazaria, after he married a Jewish lady, say, oh, I'm going to put on my coin Moses, or, these things that they say, aha, here are the Ashkenazi Jews. Those are not Hebrews or Jews. Those are somebody who is culturally appropriating being a merchant trader who has their
Well,
own secret language called Yiddish.
Well, let's be accurate. When we talk about Ashkenazi, what we're talking about is a blood mixture that occurred along the Silk Road. But we also know from the Bible that the Hebrews in exile, they intermarried with the peoples of Babylon and the surrounding area, and so therefore the genetic makeup of Hebrews was quite mixed with the people of the Silk Road, which included Turks, Khazarians, Sogdians, even Indians and Chinese. So it was a blood mixture. And then one of the curious things that came out of the study of the DNA haplogroups is that even the Chinese and Japanese identified these people as with a genetic deformity of a hook nose, a quilling nose, and which we now know is quite common among people who claim to be Ashkenazi Jews. And so I think most people who today call themselves Jews probably have never heard this history, because what we noticed is that after these, some of the modern day, I'm talking 2015, 2017, some of the researchers, a lot of them in England, started being honest about these haplogroups that they were discovering. They were discovering that the people who are in Israel had little or no Hebrew blood. And what they did have was Turkic, Persian, Sogdian, Chinese blood. And so then there were different theories about how that was possible. And there were some made up theories. One in particular was the Rhineland theory. And the question was, how did so many Jews end up in Frankfurt, Germany, when the Rothschilds began? And so there was this theory that they did a loop around through southern and Mediterranean area and then came up the Rhineland to populate. But there's no history that shows that. What we see is a consistent movement back and forth along the Silk Road from the east all the way through the southern route, which ended up in Babylon. But there were a lot of northern routes that went through Turkey, which is now Turkey, and they put a lot of their goods on ships in Smyrna, by the way, where Jamie Dimon's family ancestry is, and farther north through Greece and through Hungary and through Poland. I was in a city in Poland right along the border with Ukraine back in the 70s, and it was called Przemyśl. If you look at the word, it looks like pretzel, but it's pronounced Przemyśl. And in investigating these Radhanite Silk Road lines, we discovered that there was a major Radhanite factory in Przemyśl that was one of the northern Silk Road routes back and forth from China to Western Europe. They actually manufactured items with the goods that they were bringing back and forth. So the Radhanites were a clear thing, and they were moving into Germany, but they weren't coming from the Rhineland. They were coming from the Silk Road.
So these aren't Sephardic, Hasidic. They're not all. This is a new group of what you could call, the last word is Jews and drop the word Jews. These are Babylonian Radhanite banksters. And when I say banksters, I mean bankers who are gangsters. These are merchants, merchant bankers. What did the Jews have as their curse in Europe? They couldn't own land. Why? Because they were the original tax collectors, as you pointed out. The Radhanite, the knights, they collected taxes for their lords. So the person who collected taxes was what? Tax exempt. They also were the bankers. Oh, and they got to use usury, but they never went to jail. And then they got to control the land because they would seize the land of those who couldn't pay back their usury debt. These are the same old things happening to every American. I was explaining this to somebody. I said, let me describe to you. And then you tell me where we're at. And I described Babylon, what a common person in Babylon would be doing. And he goes, well, that's America. Correct. Yeah. The British have come to America. They've overthrown it. And Michael and I and Tyler, and by the way, Tyler and myself are co-authors of The Truth Will Set You Free. And we have worked for years to bring these truths to people. And Michael has been interviewed by just about everybody you can be interviewed, except certain people who are working on the side of evil. And they won't interview him. And first off, because they're too lazy to go to his site and actually do research. So we're going to put it into something that anyone can digest. And we have. And we just spent the weekend creating the first in this series of books, and it's going to be great. And again, I have to congratulate you and for the honesty to bring into light this moldy system that has been around for thousands of years, where the same old inbred people have been in dominant control. And let's remember, Cecil Rhodes started off, who was one of the richest men. They say he was the richest man at the time for ripping off South Africa's gold and diamonds, as Michael pointed out. He sat in a group and wanted to take over the world. And so he asked 3 other of the richest people in the world, who are all Rothschilds, to come and found Cecil Rhodes' little group, which then has become the Royal Institute for International Affairs. It's become Milner's Kindergarten. It's become the Round Table. It's become the Council on Foreign Relations, and on and on and on. And no one will go deep enough with Michael to face the pilgrims. But if you read this book, you'll have to face the pilgrims, and finally they might come to the righteous justice that they deserve.
Well, we have a picture from that book that we found in that offsite library of an event that occurred on that date was June 5th of 1909. They took a group shot of this banquet that they held, where the keynote speaker was a Rothschild by the name of Lord Rosebery, who had inherited Hannah Rothschild's fortune, and she was the richest man or richest woman in England at the time. He was the keynote speaker. The organizing committee was peopled by Rothschilds that also included people like Henry Asquith, who later became prime minister. Winston Churchill was there. Lord Walter Rothschild was there. So the names going on, we have all their names from that book. So we know who started it. And we know that they were intent on reorganizing the British Empire from basically a monarchical system to an imperial system where corporations ran the world. Now, how do we know that? Because well documented is the foundation by the British Parliament of the British South Africa Company. And that was to be their first test country where they were going to implement this new vision for organizing the world around corporations, not around governments. And they say governments were failing and corporations were more efficient. Well, there's some truth in all those things. But the point is, they were going to be the ones that were going to drive the world, and everyone was going to have to account to them. And so that's why the Rothschilds were so involved in South Africa, because they were establishing their financial mechanism through gold and diamonds to be able to back their banking going forward. And so they teamed up with the Rothschild, Cecil Rhodes, made him the CEO of the De Beers diamond mines and gold mines in South Africa, which we now can see were likely the mines of Ophir, from which Solomon got his 666 talents of gold every year for his 40-year reign, which that means he amassed a great wealth that, isn't it interesting, just disappeared. Nobody knows where. You can't see a coin that has Solomon's picture on it, but all that gold did not go away. We believe it's in the gold vaults in the city of London that was spirited out of Babylon as the Arabs, the Caliphate, was taking over Babylon. So we see all of these threads now, all marching back to Babylon, and that's why we see Bohemian Grove putting up that owl and pretending to do a child sacrifice. Well, okay, maybe they that was a fake child or not, I'm not sure. But these people were practicing some really weird stuff, and they believe it. And I think that's their secret. They know that their source comes from the demons of Babylon. And therefore, Moloch and Mammon are two demons that all of us need to be telling to get behind us. And the more of us do that, we're going to take away their power.
Absolutely. And I so agree with you. And Israel was created by Abraham. One guy invented Israel. And remember, he was involved in human sacrifice. He was willing to sacrifice his own son. So the Chaldean worship of offering children, hello, we hear right in the Old Testament that was common all around Abraham. And then Israel, what is Israel? Israel is a made up way for the British East India Company, which became British imperialism, to send unwanted Jews as a settlement into an area where they're bound to be killed. I mean, they couldn't have do anything worse than the Jews than to surround them by their deadly enemies.
Right. Those were the first settlements in the mid 1800s.
And in 1916, the Sykes-Picot.
Can I mention? Mm-hmm. And all of those early settlements were funded by Rothschilds, including Rothschilds, who were the ones who made the money from the manipulation of the bank in London after the Battle of Waterloo.
Well, of course, you have Lord Arthur Balfour speaking for the king, telling Lord Rothschild, we approve you sending a British settlement of unwanted Jews in the mission of Zion. And that's where Zionism comes from. There's many, many types of Zionism, but British Zionism is basically imperialistic control to use the Jews as cannon fodder, as they're still using them today, both with medical experimentation and the wars that never stop. And what is that? Let's remember in 1916, the Sykes-Picot secret agreement said that they chopped up the Ottoman Empire and they gave to the French and to the British Palestine, upper and lower, Israel, upper and lower, Lebanon, Syria, and they just chopped it up, right? And they even took Iraq and Iran, and the French ended up getting Iran, and the British they chopped up these areas before they knew they were filled with oil, and they really didn't want them. At one point, the trouble with the Palestinians and the Israelis got so bad later that the French just gave their section to the British. So right now, at this very day, the British monarchy owns more than 50% of the old city of Jerusalem and whole sections of Israel. But do you see them involved? No, they're hidden. They're taking the oil, the Mediterranean, what's it called? The largest deposit, one of the largest deposits, certainly in the Mediterranean, but almost in the whole world. Oil? Well, Genie Oil is in Golan Heights, and that's Jacob Rothschild, who in a zone that doesn't belong to Israel, that was stolen, that is occupied, you have a Rothschild getting the money that the U.S. gave the money to drill for it, but the Rothschilds got the oil when it came out. Same thing with Leviathan, which is the British company that's getting the money out of the Mediterranean Basin, one of the largest oil deposits in the world. All those offshore platforms, that's what the war's about. That's why Bibi Netanyahu has already been charged twice with the fraud of selling that oil to his friends, convicted, and yet he still leads Israel. And there are 3 more charges, felony charges for the same thing. So what's going on there, what we hear is not the truth. But when you realize what the British were trying to get rid of their unwanted, almost not dissident, but unwanted, they considered them a lower caste system. Yes. Send the lower caste to conquer the enemy.
That's what they also did in the formation of the YMCA and the Salvation Army. They were looking for slave replacements when they had to give up their black slaves in 1833. They devised this system through the YMCA and in the Salvation Army to populate all the plantations and all the businesses of the empire. And so it was a way to drain London of all their lower class citizens and make money from them. But before we get off of this topic, we need to go back and look at the American Revolution, Because if we think that we've ever had a time when the Rothschilds weren't influential in our life, we need to think that again. Because what we did in our deep dive of Alexander Hamilton is we realized that he was tightly tied with the banks of the City of London before the revolution, during, and afterwards. And then, if you'll notice, after the revolution, he became the first Treasury Secretary. So what we now know is that the Rothschild money, in addition to some other key families in the UK, were responsible for bankrolling our early banks, and there were four that Hamilton formed, even though they were also funding the Hessians, the Germans from Hesse, Frankfurt, to come and fight for the British. So they were going to make sure they won no matter which side won. And there we go, is another immoral bankers' war. And then we see what happened after that. They kept trying to, they fomented the War of 1812. And by the way, that army was funded by the Rothschilds as well, as they were also funding the British against Napoleon. So we see this constant churn of effort to take control of the resources of America, and that was really the key. And then if we wind it forward to 1913 in the foundation of the Federal Reserve, what we find that they're bankrolling to a great extent the balance sheet of our Federal Reserve. And from that point on, it has been just a consolidation of control as they funded all of our banks and still fund them today. So we've never gotten away from them.
Well, thank heavens a white hat like you can come along and tell us what Carroll Quigley wouldn't, what he was hiding, what all these people have been hiding, and they are so good at it. They're such good liars. Their plan, they live for their and die for their plan, and they live and die for their secrecy. And when you read a John Coleman and he tells you about the Committee of 300, yeah, no. Or the Committee of 99, yeah, no. Let's talk about real people, real deeds.
The Aspen Institute. No, there's the Bohemian Grove. Oh, wait, there's Bilderberg Group. Oh, wait, there's Aspen Institute. Oh, wait, there's how many are there?
Trilateralists.
All kabuki theater to keep our attention off of the British Pilgrim Society, in my opinion.
Correct. The World Economic Forum, the Rothschilds didn't
visit. We got the CIA too. Forgot them.
Oh, yes. Well, OSS and the MI5.
Oh, yeah.
It is unbelievable what we're facing these days, folks. But what they don't know is the liberation doesn't come from them. Liberation comes from your heart, and liberation comes from your direct interaction with the Spirit. And that cannot be put in a bank, and you can't get interest off of it either. But you can follow in the opposite direction. And once you know who these people are and where their controls are, you can actually then begin to have celestial navigation and find the way to open a new passage through some of these difficulties that are facing us all around us. And only through knowledge can you have that. And I must say that what you've done, Michael, and what we've done, and Tyla, she started off writing the Gospel of Sophia, the very thing that frees everyone from all of these things. If you just read that, it's a self-initiation. So when you look at the work that we've done, we've provided you not only the best spotlight upon evil that you'll ever find, but in almost every single case, we also give you the antidote. And the antidote in this case, seek truth, beauty, and goodness.